How does an experienced swimmer end up dead in the water? Why would a case become more confusing after investigators started looking deeper instead of clearer? And why did everything change the moment new audio recordings surfaced? Those three questions are now at the center of the Nolan Wells investigation. First came the claim that he drowned. Then his family's attorney revealed he knew how to swim and had been to Horn Island before. Soon after, newly released audio added another layer of mystery, raising even more questions about what really happened that day. So if the evidence keeps creating new doubts instead of closing the case, what are we still missing? Let's examine every detail, because the biggest answer may be hiding in the evidence everyone has heard. But few have truly connected Nolan Wells knew how to swim. He had taken lessons as a child. He had been to Horn Island before, walked its beaches, waded in its water, returned home every single time. On the afternoon of July 4th, 2026, the 18-year-old from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, stepped off a boat onto that same island with 3 friends at his side. He was carrying his phone and his keys. By nightfall, he was gone. And by the time the sun rose 2 days later, the sheriff's office had already decided, before the autopsy was finished, before the toxicology reports existed, before a single investigator had finished asking questions, that no one was to blame. That is where this story begins. Not with a body in the water, but with a conclusion that arrived before the facts had a chance to catch up. If this is your first time here, hit like and subscribe to Crime Dive Network. Every case we cover is built on verified reporting, and your support keeps these stories in front of the people who need to hear them. Nolan Xavier Wells was a student athlete, a wide receiver, a young man described by those who knew him as humble, hard-working, the kind of person who lit up a room without trying to own it. On Independence Day, he joined a group of friends on a boat trip to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast. It is uninhabited. No roads, no buildings, just sand, water, and the boats that ferry people. There for the holiday. Nolan was last seen on the island around 3 in the afternoon. What happened in the hours that followed depends entirely on who you ask. What is not in dispute is this. When his friends returned to the mainland, Nolan was not with them. His phone was. His keys were, and no one had called his mother. Christine Wansley reported her son missing shortly after midnight on July 5th. What followed was a massive search involving the Coast Guard, the National Park Service, and volunteer groups scouring the island and the surrounding water. On the morning of July 6th, a U.S. park ranger discovered a body in the water near the northwestern tip of the island. Dental records confirmed what the family already feared. Nolan Wells was dead. And then came the statement. 4 words released to the public by the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. No foul play suspected. It was issued within hours of the body's recovery. The autopsy had not been completed. The toxicology work had not been finished. The kind of laboratory analysis that death investigations depend on. The weeks of careful examination that families wait through in anguish had not had time to produce a single result. And yet a conclusion had already been offered to the world, as though it were settled. For a mother absorbing the worst news of her life, for a father hearing details second-hand, that statement did not sound like an investigation still unfolding. It sounded like a door closing on a room no one had finished searching. Most families in this position are allowed to fall apart quietly. They are surrounded by casseroles and sympathy cards, and given the space to simply feel the loss without also having to chase it. Nolan's family did not have that luxury. In the exact days when they should have been allowed to grieve, they were making phone calls to attorneys. They were asking questions that investigators had not answered, and they were making a decision that no parent should ever have to consider. Through their attorney, they arranged to have Nolan's body sent out of state, away from every office connected to Mississippi law enforcement. so that a fully independent medical examiner could conduct a second, separate review built from nothing but the evidence itself. Sit with that decision for a moment. This is a family already broken open by loss, choosing to delay saying goodbye a little longer, choosing to trust a stranger in another city more than the process unfolding in their own backyard. That is not a decision made out of anger. It is a decision made out of necessity by people who had already learned, in the hardest way possible, that the first answer is not always the whole answer. Now there are two investigations running in parallel, two autopsies, two sets of findings expected on different timelines, built by people who have never consulted each other, and a question hanging over both of them that no one can answer yet. What happens if they do not agree? What happens if the state's findings and the independent findings describe two different stories entirely? Because if that happens, this case does not move toward resolution. It moves toward something far heavier. Two competing truths, and a family caught in the space between them, still waiting, still holding their breath. But the body is not the only evidence in this case. And the questions do not stop at the autopsy table. When investigators began reconstructing Nolan's final hours, one detail surfaced that has never sat right with the people closest to this case. His phone, the one device that could hold his last messages, his last calls, the last trace of what he said and to whom in the hours before his friends left that island without him, did not stay with him. It ended up in the possession of the friends who returned. The family's attorney raised this publicly, on the record, in front of reporters. If investigators are willing to examine Nolan's phone, the attorney argued, every phone present on that trip deserves the exact same scrutiny. Not one device treated differently from the rest. Every phone, every person. The same standard, applied evenly, because anything less invites the very question this family has been asking quietly since the beginning. Is everyone being looked at the same way, or is someone being spared a closer look? That request has been made formally to the district attorney's office. As of the most recent reporting available, there is no public confirmation of whether it has actually been carried out. No timeline, no results, just a request sitting somewhere inside a process the public cannot see into, while the family waits on the other side of it, checking the news every morning for an update that has not yet come. There is a particular cruelty in waiting for information that someone else already has. It is one thing to grieve an absence you cannot explain. It is another thing entirely to suspect that somewhere in a file or a folder or a locked phone sitting in an evidence room, the explanation already exists and simply has not been handed over yet. That is the position this family has occupied for weeks now, not wondering if an answer is out there, knowing it probably is, and having no way to reach it themselves. So here is where the case stands, stripped down to what is actually known, and nothing more. A conclusion offered before the science existed to support it. Two separate medical examinations running independently, with no guarantee they will agree, and a set of phones that may hold the clearest, most human record of what happened on that island. Evidence that, as far as the public knows, may still be sitting untouched. 3 open questions. No answers yet. And then the timeline grew teeth. The earliest explanation floated for Nolan's death was drowning. But according to the family's attorney, that explanation does not sit easily with what he knows about Nolan himself. This was not someone who feared the water. This was not someone unfamiliar with the currents around that island. For a family already questioning how quickly officials moved to rule out foul play, a drowning explanation involving a confident, experienced swimmer only added another question to the pile. Then came the audio, recordings obtained by NBC News, captured on the day Nolan went missing, documented the friends who were with him calling for help after their boat reportedly broke down. The call came around 4 in the afternoon, roughly an hour after Nolan was last seen. The voice on the recording is clear. The boat is taking on water near the western tip of Horn Island. The caller says everyone aboard is safe, but Nolan was not aboard, and the recording does not explain when he stopped being with them, or why he was left behind, while the vessel that brought him there began to sink. It is a detail that adds a new layer to an already tangled timeline. A boat in trouble out on the water sometime before Nolan was left on that island. What it does not do is explain why he was left there, or what happened in the hours after. Separately, a video began circulating online that appeared to capture an argument taking place on the beach that day. It spread fast, with viewers speculating about who was involved and what was said. The family's attorney claimed Nolan could be heard in the footage, saying words that suggested distress. But two of Nolan's friends came forward publicly to say the person in that video was not Nolan. One of them told reporters he had stepped away to check on a different friend during an unrelated disagreement, and that the video itself had been recorded too far away to clearly capture what was actually said. It is a reminder of how easily a case like this one can outrun the facts once it is moving fast enough online, and it leaves the public with two versions of the same afternoon, one captured on a screen, one described in a statement, neither one complete. And then, most recently, federal law enforcement entered the story in a way it had not before. The FBI confirmed it is investigating threats connected to this case. Threats made, they said, against individuals tied to the matter. The Bureau did not specify who received them or what form they took, only that federal agents are now working alongside the ongoing local investigation. Federal agents do not typically get involved in boating accidents. They get involved when something crosses state lines, when the temperature around a case rises high enough that local jurisdiction is no longer enough. None of these details resolve the central questions this case still carries. Not the autopsy, not the toxicology report, not the phones, but together they show a case that keeps expanding rather than narrowing. New claims, new audio, new denials, and now a federal inquiry running quietly in parallel with everything else. The overall picture has not changed. There are still no results. There is still no timeline. And there is still a family back in Ocean Springs waiting on answers that keep almost arriving and never quite do. This case did not stay contained to a single stretch of the Mississippi coastline. Within days of Nolan's disappearance, his story had already spread far beyond it. Not because a network assigned it, not because a producer somewhere greenlit the coverage, but because ordinary people kept sharing it, kept returning to it, kept asking the same handful of questions in 100 different ways across every platform where people gather to talk about the things that will not leave them alone. Part of what drew that attention from the very first days was a photograph. In the images that circulated before any official statement, before any press conference, one detail stood out immediately to anyone who looked closely. Nolan appears to be the only black teenager in a group of mostly white friends. On its own, that detail proves nothing. Officials and outlets covering this case have said exactly that publicly from the very start. A photograph is not evidence of what happened on an island, but paired with everything else that followed, the early declaration ruling out foul play before the science existed to support it, and the fact that Nolan's phone ended up with someone else entirely, that detail stopped sitting quietly in the background. It moved to the center of the conversation, whether anyone intended it to or not. A reward of $125,000 has been offered for information leading to an arrest or conviction. The case is expected to be presented to a grand jury, and somewhere in the space between what officials have said publicly and what has actually been confirmed, this story keeps circling back to the same unavoidable point. Somebody knows what happened on that island. The question that remains is whether anyone is going to make them say it. There is a particular photograph from that afternoon on Horn Island that will not stop circulating. In it, Nolan Wells stands on a beach with a group of teenagers, smiling like any 18-year-old on a holiday. And if you look at that image for more than a second, one detail becomes impossible to unsee. He appears to be the only black teenager in a mostly white group. That single photograph did not cause what happened next. It did not pull him from the water, or place his phone in someone else's hand, but it became the lens through which thousands of people began to see this case. And once that lens was fixed, the story stopped being about one family in Mississippi and started being about something much larger, something harder to name and impossible to ignore. Online, people who had spent years being the only person of color in a room, on a team, in a friend group, began telling their own stories. Not accusations aimed at anyone specific, not claims about what happened to Nolan, just recognition, the particular uneasy feeling of standing out in a group photo, and what that feeling can turn into the moment something goes wrong and you are no longer there to explain your own side of it. That recognition is a large part of why this story refused to stay local. If this story has stayed with you since part 1, hit like and subscribe to Crime Dive Network. We are tracking every development, and the next update could be the one that breaks this case open. What began as a missing persons case, out of a small stretch of coastline, became, in the language used by outlet after outlet, a story that struck a nerve far beyond the state itself. It reopened conversations that have never fully closed in that part of the country, about who gets believed quickly and who has to fight to be believed at all. About how fast a case gets treated as settled when the right people are not watching closely enough. About a regional history many hoped had been left further in the past than it actually has. For parents of black teenagers watching this unfold, the ordinary fact of a group trip, a boat, a weekend with friends suddenly carried a weight it never used to carry. That shift, quiet and largely invisible to anyone outside the community feeling it, is one of the reasons this case has not faded the way so many others do. And still running underneath all of it, there has been caution, restraint, a refusal from multiple directions to declare a verdict before there is evidence to support one. Reporters covering this case have been careful to say the same thing in nearly identical language more than once. Nobody covering this story has claimed to know exactly what happened on that island. Not the journalists writing about it. Not the family's own attorney standing in front of cameras answering questions from the press. What they have said consistently is that too many basic answerable questions remain open. A timeline that does not add up. Results that have not been released. Phones that may or may not have been examined. For anyone on any side of this conversation, to claim they already have the full picture would be premature. That is the tension sitting at the center of this case right now. On one side, a public that has already formed a feeling shaped by a photograph, a delay, and a statement made too soon. On the other, an investigation that has not yet produced a finding anyone can point to and call final. The case sits uncomfortably in the space between what people believe happened on that island and what has actually been proven. And that space is exactly where this story remained on Monday, July 20th. Centerpoint Church, Ocean Springs, Mississippi. A building meant to hold a congregation on an ordinary Sunday was filled well past capacity on a Monday that carried none of the ordinary weight a church usually holds. Cars lined the streets outside for blocks. People who had never met Nolan Wells stood outside because there was no room left inside, waiting simply to be near a moment that had already reached far beyond this one small stretch of the Mississippi coast. Standing in front of all of them was a man who has stood in that exact position more times than anyone in this country should ever have to. The Reverend Al Sharpton, delivering the eulogy for an 18-year-old he never had the chance to meet while he was alive. Sharpton did not deliver a quiet service. From the moment he stepped to the pulpit, he made clear this would not be a eulogy that simply mourned. It would be a eulogy that demanded. Standing before the casket, he reached back into a history Mississippi has spent generations trying to leave behind, and he refused to let the room look away from it for even a moment. He spoke the name Emmett Till. He spoke the name Medgar Evers. Two names that, in this particular state, carry the full unresolved weight of a past this country has never fully reckoned with. And in speaking them, Sharpton placed Nolan Wells's name directly beside them, whether the family had asked for that comparison or not. It was now part of the room, part of the record, part of how this case would be remembered going forward. And then, in the middle of that eulogy, Sharpton did something a funeral almost never includes. He turned from grief to action. Live, in front of the entire congregation, he announced $50,000 for anyone with information that leads to real answers in Nolan's case. Not a press conference. Not a written statement released later through an office. A reward offered from the pulpit itself, in the middle of laying a child to rest. Before the words had even finished settling over the room, word reached him from his phone. Filmmaker Tyler Perry, who had already quietly and without seeking attention paid for the funeral itself, was matching the pledge in real time. 50,000 became 100,000. Announced out loud inside the service to a room that had walked in to mourn and was now leaving with something closer to a mission. Near the close of the funeral, attorney Ben Crump, who has stood beside this family since the earliest, most disorienting days of the investigation, stepped forward and led the congregation in a chant. It began low near the front pews, and it rose, row by row, until it carried out through the open doors and into the parking lot beyond them. Nolan's life mattered. Repeated again and again by a room that had gathered to bury a teenager and left instead, demanding together out loud that his death not be allowed to quietly disappear into an unfinished file somewhere in a records office. By the time the service ended and the crowd began to move outside into the Mississippi afternoon, one fact remained exactly as it had been the day before: the independent autopsy the family requested. The one meant to stand completely apart from any finding connected to Mississippi law enforcement, still had not produced results made public. As of the most recent reporting available, that result remains pending, sitting somewhere between a laboratory and a family that has already waited far longer than any family should have to. A funeral gave this family a place to grieve publicly, surrounded by people who came from across the country to stand with them. It did not give them what they came looking for 2 weeks ago, in the very first hours after Nolan didn't come home. It did not give them an answer, but the day was not finished. Once the service ended, once the crowd began filing out into the Mississippi afternoon, the family did something they have done more than once since this began. They walked straight from a funeral into a press conference, because grief in this case has never been allowed to stand alone. It has always come paired with questions that still need asking. Standing outside Centerpoint Church in front of a wall of cameras that had already been rolling for hours, attorney Ben Crump confirmed what his team had agreed to days earlier in a meeting with the Jackson County District Attorney. A mutual inspection of Nolan's phone. Crump's own experts working alongside Jackson County investigators, examining the same device together side by side, rather. Then in separate rooms, with separate conclusions. It was the closest thing to a concrete next step this case had produced in 2 weeks. Crump also gave the room a detail that had not been widely known before that afternoon. It took 6 days. 6 days between the state's official autopsy and the moment the family's independent examiner finally received Nolan's body in Washington, D.C. 6 days that, in a case already defined by urgency and its absence, only deepened the family's sense that time itself had not been on their side. A reporter asked the question that has followed this case since the beginning. Was there any update on the independent autopsy results? Crump's answer was careful and honest, and not the answer anyone in that crowd wanted to hear. Not yet. The findings were still being finalized. No date. No promise beyond the fact that when the results exist, the family has said they will share them. Another reporter turned the conversation toward the other young men who had been on that island with Nolan, and whether their phones would receive the same scrutiny as his. Crump confirmed that request had already been communicated to the district attorney's office, and that fairness demanded it. If Nolan's phone was going to be examined, he said, so should every phone that was present that day. What he could not confirm standing there in front of the cameras was whether that examination had actually begun. By the end of that press conference, one thing had become clear to everyone watching. No suspect has been named, no homicide has been declared, and no answers have arrived. What has arrived again and again is a family standing in front of microphones hours after burying their son, still doing the work of pressing for information that should have come to them, not the other way around. And that is perhaps the hardest part of this entire story to sit with. Grief on its own is already one of the heaviest things a human being can carry. This family has been asked to carry it while also carrying a mystery, checking their phones for updates in the middle of planning a funeral, answering reporters' questions about autopsies in the same week they were choosing a casket. There is no version of that experience that gets easier with time, not until the questions finally have answers to match them. Somewhere in Ocean Springs tonight, in a house that is probably still full of flowers from that day, a mother is likely lying awake, running through the same handful of moments she has run through every night for 2 weeks. The last conversation, the last text message, the last ordinary Tuesday before any of this had a name attached to it. That is not something a reward or a eulogy, or even a room full of strangers who came to stand beside her can fully reach. Support helps. It does not answer the question that matters most, and everyone in that church knew it, even as they applauded, even as they sang, even as they promised to keep fighting. From here, this case moves into what may be its most decisive phase yet. 2 threads now carry the full weight of what happens next, the results of that independent autopsy, whenever they finally arrive, and confirmation of whether the phones belonging to every teenager who was on that island have actually been examined the way the family has publicly and repeatedly requested. Those 2 threads are what this entire case now hangs on, and we will be tracking both the moment either one surfaces. If you want to be there the second this case breaks open, subscribe to Crime Dive Network and turn on notifications. This is a story we will keep following until it has an ending that actually answers something. A family buried their son in front of hundreds of strangers who became, if only for one afternoon, part of their grief. What they still have not buried, and what they may not be able to bury for a long time to come, is the question of why he never came home.